I'm Paul Coggin. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama in the U.S. And so this presentation we're going to dive into a broad set of topics related to space and cybersecurity. When we start talking about space, one of the key components is the ground systems. Think of a ground system as the kind of like your NOC or your SOC in your enterprise network, where you manage your enterprise network infrastructure. With similar with space systems, they have ground stations that will be spread out across the world, so that you have visibility. No matter where your assets are in orbit, you have visibility and you can communicate with your assets, and you can download information from the payload, as well as be able to send commands to the payload and to the spacecraft itself. And in this example, we're showing a ground station network for NASA. But other space systems constellations will have a ground station network similar to this. But the big trend, everyone's talking about public cloud these days. Well, also with space is utilizing the public cloud. There's Leaf Space out of Italy, Kubos, who's got an application called Major Tom that is hosted in Amazon AWS. Amazon is offering space ground station services in the cloud, where you can outsource the ground station to Amazon, where they have the antennas spread across geographic locations, their data centers, so that you don't have to go build a large ground station network. You can just outsource to them. Microsoft Azure has their orbit service as well. And my understanding is Google is doing similarly for SpaceX Starlink's project. So space is moving to the cloud. So and also similarly, it's not real surprising that space providers are using infrastructure in the public cloud. But what really surprised me as I started digging into space technologies is that space has actually moved, that cloud is actually moving to space in some cases, where vendors such as Leo Cloud, new startups like Leo Cloud, are actually going to put cloud infrastructure on their satellites in space, so that the image processing that is happening in space, where there's all kinds of imaging and data being gathered, can be pre-processed in space and then sent back down to Earth as needed. Instead of having to send everything, they're going to have data center capabilities in space to provide all kinds of different services, which is going to generate a lot of interesting scenarios and questions for the cybersecurity industry, with all those assets going up into space. Something I was going to make you aware of, a big problem with space is radiation, and I'm going to go deeper into this. And so there's companies that are coming out with new technologies to support the data centers moving to space, with like Ramon out of Israel, who's created like a terabyte hard drive that's hardened for the harsh environment of space. So this market is really developing quickly to support this. And what really got my attention here recently, as I was preparing this presentation, is there's a startup that's looking at actually putting data centers on the moon in lava tunnels, possibly on the moon. So that's going. So the cloud is definitely moving to space quickly. And there's one more example of NTT, a telecommunications company out of Japan, and they're planning on building a constellation, and the different satellites will have storage capability similar to your data center on Earth, but they're going to have that on their satellites, and then they're going to be interconnected. There's going to be a large network interconnected with lasers, free space optics. So it's going to be a large network, just like what we have here on the ground, but it's all just going to be up in space. So this market is quickly evolving, and then it goes, like I said, it's going to bring in a lot of new questions about cybersecurity. You know, how are we going to deal with incident response, forensics, recovery, denial of service, lots of different scenarios. as all of those networks that we're used to having on the ground are moving up to space. Now, when we get into space, depending on the application, it could be running the satellites like OneWeb, the SpaceX Starlink. Those satellites are typically running at LEO in a low Earth orbit. Now, your cable TV and a lot of your telecommunications satellites, they're typically in GEO, where in LEO, those satellites are in low Earth orbit. They're revolving around the Earth around about every 4 hours. They're making an orbit around the Earth. With GEO, those satellites are fixed, and they're pointed to follow the Earth's rotation, so they're always pointing at the same place on the Earth with your geosats that we're very familiar with for telecommunications. But what you're hearing about in the news so much lately is with OneWeb and SpaceX, et cetera, is the LEO orbits. Now, from a threat standpoint, from a cybersecurity and just physical kinetic threats, the American scientists, the Federation of American Scientists have defined like 5 major categories of threats to space. You have deception, where someone's going to mess with you. Think about like spoofing GPS. There's a lot of information out there now in the news about AIS information that the ships use to know their location, GPS, GNSS here in Europe being spoofed. Temporary disruption, maybe like electronic warfare, where someone turns on a radio frequency jammer where the signal is jammed temporarily, and as soon as the power is removed, the signal is restored. That would, some disruption. Or it could be that there's a denial of service where someone goes and saturates the link somehow. And then a degradation could be maybe they're using a laser or something that's actually damaged the satellite. Or complete destruction, because there's been a lot of that in the news lately, like a missile test against a satellite to blow the satellite up and then creates a debris field, which creates the concern of what we call Kessler syndrome, where there could be a chain reaction of debris hitting debris or other space assets, and it causes a chain reaction to the point that space is no longer usable because of the debris field. And some of the threats, some of them are reversible, like I've mentioned, the electronic warfare. You turn on the signal, you turn on the jammer, and it affects the system. You remove the power, and it'll go away, all the way to threats like a missile hitting a rocket and blowing it up. And in that case, it would be non-reversible. And then with cyber, it could be reversible or non-reversible depending on the type of attack. But speaking of the non-reversible, I just wanted to, as I was researching this, I wanted to bring this out of some examples of some kinetic attacks. Back in the 70s, I thought it was interesting to learn that in the 70s, the space station, ALMA, that the Soviet Union actually had a machine gun on it, a cannon, 23 millimeter cannon. I thought that was really interesting. And there's talk about war in space a lot these days. Well, this is a satellite that the French are looking at building. It's actually going to either have a submachine gun or lasers on it. So it's real interesting. But we're talking about focusing on cybersecurity for this talk. And with the cybersecurity, the issues that we're looking at are jamming, which is going to be like electronic warfare. It's going to be your radio frequency. Malware, we'll get into some examples of malware in space. Spoofing, we mentioned earlier, like GPS and GNSS. Spoofing the timing capability, GPS capability. The control system for the satellite, targeting the payload system for the satellite, maybe hacking, eavesdropping. In the eavesdropping, it's easier to do than you may realize, because we're going to have a lot of examples of this. A lot of the satellite communications are not encrypted, though we assume it's encrypted. It's not. In many cases, it's not. I'm going to give a lot of examples. And so then from a threat standpoint, there's a lot of different threats. We could be a nation state, it could be military, it could be intel. They're going to have a lot more sophisticated capabilities to come at your system with, and then all the way down to more unsophisticated users that may be just eavesdropping. It doesn't take a whole lot of funding to to get the equipment needed to just passively eavesdrop on unencrypted satellite traffic. Now, when I talk about cybersecurity problems, especially from an offensive standpoint, I like to do attack trees. So, real high-level strategy for the attack tree might be to go, if you're looking at somebody's going after a satellite system, might be to go after the ground station as an insider threat, or try to figure out how to get through the VPN firewall, like in the case of what happened with Viasat here recently. Somebody got into the ground system that controlled the user terminals. Then there's a scenario of SAT to SAT. That right now, everything I can see with SAT to SAT is all theoretical. There's nothing that I've been able to read out in the press, no books or papers that go into real world examples of SAT to SAT, but it's probably something that we'll see in the future. And there's the possibility, especially with the lack of strong encryption, it could be that someone could go and stand up their own ground station and try to communicate with your satellite if they have the resources. And so here's an example. Back a few years ago, everybody was talking about Stuxnet, and as I was working on doing this research, I found it really interesting that apparently at Black Hat, someone published that not only did Stuxnet go and spread around the globe, but it also apparently was able to affect a satellite for a cable TV operator in India for the Insat 4B satellite. Apparently, somehow, the Stuxnet malware got into the ground station and was able to go and spread to the Insat 4B satellite. And what I gathered researching online is it appears that the Siemens PLC might have been used to control the solar panels on the satellite, and so that malware was able to disable the satellite so that it no longer responded, and then the cable TV company in India, it is said, lost their satellite because of the solar panels no longer responded. So that's one issue. Now, this is all in the news here lately about the solar storms coming from the sun. There's all these cosmic rays that are coming out of the sun with protons and ions that are headed toward the Earth. They can cause all kinds of disruptions with the power grid. I read an article where up here in northern Europe that there was problems with some train stations where the solar storms are sending so many particles to the Earth that it was causing disruption with the trains, with the signaling, where there may not be a train on the tracks, but because of the particles, the ions being sent to the Earth from the sun, it was causing the signaling to believe that there was actually a train on the tracks when there wasn't. But it can cause all kinds of disruptions, all this these particles coming in from the sun, especially in space. And I've kind of termed it Einstein denial of service, because that's what E = mc squared, his equation he's so famous for, is to define the energy of the mass in the speed, which is the speed of light square of the particles that are heading out into the solar system sourced from the sun. Now, these solar storms, these cosmic rays, these ions and particles that are flying through space, that's the reason that a lot of the spacecraft are not using encryption. Because if they want to use encryption, whoever the designers, the manufacturers of the spacecraft would have to go use radiation hardened equipment. They would have to spend a lot more money hardening that equipment to survive the hostile environment of space. And the last thing you want to do is put a satellite in space or spacecraft in space. You didn't spend the money up front to get it hardened against the radiation and all the particles that are getting sent through the galaxy, through space, and have disruptions of your encryption. Because what happens, there's specifically the ion charges. When it hits the electronics on a spacecraft, it could just take one particle, and it causes what they call a single event upset, and it'll flip a bit in the electronics. And if you're doing encryption, it'll mess up all that keying, and then you're going to lose your connection, and you're going to lose your contact with the payload, as well as you're going to lose your control of the spacecraft. And so you got to go and wait for that system to reestablish, resync the encryption so that you can log back into your system again. So that's the reason that a lot of the spacecraft, if they don't go through the expense of getting the radiation hardening, they're not going to use encryption because they'll lose control of their satellite. And so here's an example. Here's an example of a satellite that was not encrypted, and apparently some ham radio operators, some smart, innovative folks discovered that the satellite was not encrypted and was open in Brazil, and they started using an open satellite for their communication purposes, for like CB radio, and at one point they arrested 39 people across 6 states in Brazil, and by the time they got through arresting everybody and trying to get them off of that satellite that they were illegally using, other people were using that satellite. Because once you get up in space, it's kind of hard to go up there and start adding, bolting and encryption and security onto the spacecraft after the fact, kind of like down here on Earth. It's hard to go and secure it after the fact. Another famous example is proving the point that a lot of the satellite communications are not encrypted is the Turla malware command control, where the malware would infect an end user and then send out communications to IP addresses that were being spoofed in satellite network footprints across Southern Europe and North Africa. And so the malware would get infected. It would phone home to some spoofed IP address. It was for some satellite user IP address. It was being spoofed, and then once they received the handshake, the notification, then they would go and use a landline connection to establish the two-way, send commands back to whoever was infected. And so again, this would not be happening. The spoofing would not work if they were using encryption. Now, again, this is calling out a scenario that right now is theoretical, but it's something to keep out there in mind. Another reason to go and harden these systems, design security into these new space systems, what they're calling Space 2.0, that's happening in the world economy right now, to build into cybersecurity initially, is because at some point, not only could there be ground to satellite attacks, but there could be vectors evolve where it could go sat to sat, either over RF or possibly optics. It's going to be a lot harder to do that with optics, but certainly possible with RF. Now, here's a real-world example of a satellite that was taken control of. There's a U.S.-German satellite called ROSAT, and someone got control of it, and they were able to point it at the sun and get the satellite to the point that the satellite was disabled and no longer of use. Then there's the Landsat 7 satellite. It was taken control of twice, back in 2007 and 2008. 2 different times that satellite was accessed, and according to what's out on the internet, when that satellite was taken control of, whoever the actor was, they got control, but they did not go and utilize the access that they had. What I read between the lines in it is it's probably kind of like a Windows person getting a shell on a Unix box. They got access, they got a shell, but they know Windows and they don't know Unix. So what are you going to do? So the people who manage and operate the satellite were able to recover and get back control of their satellite on 2 different occasions, because whoever got access didn't know what they were doing. It's kind of like me getting into a VMS box. I wouldn't know what I was doing. Similarly, there's a Terra satellite, and it was also compromised in 2008, June of 2008 and October of 2008. Very similarly, it was accessed twice, and whoever the users are, they had the privileged access, but again, the owners of the satellites were able to kick them off the satellite. They did not go and do anything with their access, but they did have control. They were able to get in, kind of like I said, they got the shell, but they didn't know what to do with it once they got there. That's my perception of the research I've done. Is bad guys being bad guys, typically they're going to start escalating privilege and spreading influence, right? So the analogy in my mind I keep going back to is the Windows hacker with a shell on a Unix box. It's going to be a long project. Going to have to get the books out. And when you get into these satellites, there's some other research I've done. There is a large number of operating systems, there's a large number of command languages, and there's a long list of protocols that they use. So what you end up with, one of the things I perceive is kind of a security by obscurity. Because you got to know, you might need to know the operating system, you need to know the command languages, et cetera, and that probably is buying the owners of the system some time so that they can get control back of the satellite. Because a lot of these satellites have what the feature called watchdog, so that it can restore itself at a certain point. If there's some activities, if the satellite doesn't respond, something's weird going on with it, maybe if there's just a general issue, kind of the watchdog monitoring, I'm thinking might have been, in these cases, might have just rebooted the satellite or something to kick the bad guys off. I'm totally speculating, but just based on what I'm reading. Then again, in 2014, there was a satellite, a weather satellite, they got hacked, and we got back control of it, but they got access of that as well. Now this was one that really interested me. There's apparently the Brits have, the Brit military has some satellites. They have 4 of them called Skynet. And apparently someone got access to one of the satellites and held it for ransom in 1999. I found that really interesting because you can't open your email or open a browser these days without reading something about ransomware attacks. Well, this wasn't a malware ransomware attack, but somebody was able to get into the satellite and held it for ransom, apparently. Now, also on the space station, there's been 2 documented events on the space station where a thumb drive and a laptop were accidentally introduced malware onto the International Space Station. Now, it was not introduced into the flight control system of the space station where it would threaten the lives of the astronauts or with the mission system, but apparently got into some network on the system. So there's 2 cases that are documented of malware being introduced to space station. And we were having some conversations earlier about insider trust, some of us, and this goes back to, everyone gets vetted. Everyone, is supposed to be a good person that we trust to have access into our data centers, onto our enterprise networks, work in our SOCs, work in our network operation centers, and have the physical access and badge access to our data centers and stuff. Well, the same thing with these ground stations. We got to monitor everyone's roles and responsibilities in their access to the network, and not just leave all the ports open on these networks and control access to what can be plugged into our networks. Because in this case, someone apparently found an open network connection and is able to stick a Raspberry Pi on the network for a period and steal data. So now, it's not all just the wild, wild west out there. There is international committees, groups that do meet from Europe, the U.S., Japan, from countries around the world that are meeting to come up with how the protocols should work, how encryption should work, what are the best practices for space architectures. You know, the European Space Agency, NASA, all of these different organizations, the commercial organizations, they all work together and come up with these standards. It's just, it's like security in the enterprise. There's a whole lot of standards out there getting created by the ITU and IEEE, IETF, et cetera, but, you know, we got to follow them and implement them. And so there's just some of the documentation that's out there that's international standards for security and best practices I'll throw up there. Now, this is a pretty comprehensive list of what I've been able to find thus far of best practices for securing space systems. There's NIST. A lot of people in the international community follow NIST for best practices and standards. This past year, they've released the NIST 8401 and NIST 8270 documents for securing space systems. There's the CISA, the FCC, they've all have best practice standards. And here just recently, like in the last 2 weeks, I've discovered that Germany has also released best practices for securing space systems. So there's a lot of best practices and guidelines that have been released for how to secure the spacecraft and the ground systems. The key is going to be is reviewing those best practices and getting them turned into policy, and let that drive our systems engineering and design of these systems. But the guidelines are out there. Some of the thoughts that I have after doing all this research is, the drum that everyone's beating these days is the DevSecOps, and take all these standards like we just had listed and build that into our processes when we're doing our initial systems engineering and creating our requirements and monitoring our supply chain. Because we get the spacecraft up in space and somebody's embedded some bad firmware. We get some hot firmware in somewhere in that supply chain. It's going to be hard to go and fix it, flash the EEPROM once it's up in space, or fix an operating system. Now, one of the things that's really of interest to me is some of us were talking last night and earlier today, is a lot of the satellites now, the new technology, a lot of people are talking about is a software-defined satellite, where containers and virtual machines are being used technology are being used on the satellites, and that's going to open up a whole new domain of capabilities and features for not only unique payloads, but also for security. Because when we get containers and virtual machines going, why can we not go and add a virtual machine or containers for security monitoring? Because we're getting all this new storage, like we showed earlier, and so maybe we could go and start adding intrusion prevention systems, adding machine learning and AI to monitor the commands and the behavior of the satellite. And if we sense that somebody's doing something nefarious to our satellite, there's something suspicious happening, we can restore to a known good container or known good VM, and monitor our all the commands that are being sent to us. And if somebody's sending commands out of order, commands that we are not expecting, maybe that could trigger a reconfiguration of the system. Now, this is where I'm going next with the research. It is looking at building out a cyber range, myself, a space cyber range. Here's some tools that are free. If you're interested in space and you want to do a deeper dive and learn satellites, the orbit, the ground systems, NASA, who in the U.S. is our government agency that manages space systems for the U.S., kind of like the European Space Agency here in Europe. They've released the NASA Core Flight System. That is a CubeSat software system that actually flies on CubeSats. You could use Cosmos from Ball Aerospace to act like a ground station. And NASA's also released the 42 space simulator that will model the orbit for your satellites. So you could run it all in VMs on your laptop. And then there's another CubeSat that NASA's released called NOS3, that you may find interesting in. There's some other open source projects called Artemis and Satnogs I would encourage you to look at. And one that's popped on my radar here recently is Icarus. And Icarus is a tool that's out on GitHub. Icarus was designed to model, simulate constellations like Starlink and OneWeb, so you can go in and model and simulate for different satellite constellations like DDoS type stuff. And that Icarus framework is open source. So that's another good tool to go look at if you want to dig into and learn more about space.